What's up, everybody? This is Greg Jackson with the Black Urban and Rural Policy Review, and I'm coming to you today to let you know that the Voting Rights Act is under attack. 60 years after the Voting Rights Act was put into place and it has changed the trajectory of American democracy, critics are now saying that the Supreme Court has effectively dismantled its last meaningful protections. And southern states right now, Louisiana, Tennessee, Florida, are already rushing to redraw political maps in ways that civil rights activists are likening to the Jim Crow era. So this isn't just a legal story. This is a story about who actually gets political power and whether race can still be protected under federal law. And also, it is a case of whether democracy itself is becoming structurally unequal. But how did we get here? That's the first thing that we've got to understand. But also, this is not something that has happened overnight. This is something that has been taking place, or this is something that has been happening year over year for a period of over a decade. If we trace back in history to 2013, there was a court case, Shelby County versus Holder. So originally, the Voting Rights Act, it included something called a preclearance, which meant that states with a history of racial discrimination, particularly in the South, they had to get federal approval before they could change any type of election law. So basically, if Texas wanted stricter voter ID laws, if Georgia wanted to close polling booths, if Alabama wanted to redraw voting maps, they first had to prove that these practices were not discriminatory, racially discriminatory in practice. I liken it to a driver with a DUI, someone who is a habitual DUI offender. In, in essence, if you want to drive a vehicle, you have to prove that you're not drunk in order to drive. So in this case, states who had a history of being racist had to prove that they weren't being racist in order to make a change to the voting laws. Does that make sense? So in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court struck that down and they said that this is no longer needed. Chief Justice John Roberts at the time, quote, said in quote, our country has changed, meaning America is not racist like it used to be. And so, because of this, we do not have to force certain states to have a different process than their counterparts. And so, what that meant now that states could do whatever they wanted to do and not prove that it wasn't racist, even though they've had a history year after year, decade after decade of having racially motivated practices when it comes to voting. And so, within hours of this Supreme Court decision, the state of Texas immediately moved into implementing stricter voter ID laws. And also, other southern states followed suit and pushed and advanced new restrictions regarding voting. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, this is like throwing away your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm just because you aren't getting wet. That is what she called this. She said, in essence, this is lunacy. And so that's 2013. In 2021, there's another case, Bronovich versus the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. And so what happens is Arizona, the state of Arizona, passes a law that rejects ballots that were placed or cast in the wrong precinct. They also restricted who could turn in or return absentee ballots. Civil rights groups at the time said that this practice disproportionately affected minority voters. But what did the Supreme Court do? The Supreme Court supported Arizona and took their side, establishing a narrower standard for proving discrimination under the Voting Rights Act. What the Supreme Court basically said was not every voting inconvenience equals racial discrimination. So, before Bronovich, courts often ask the question, does this law disproportionately hurt minority voters? After the decision, the question shifts and turns into, is the burden of inconvenience severe enough to count as discrimination. And here's the thing about this reframing or shift in the essential question. Now, with this question of is the burden severe enough to count as discrimination, it creates a harder criteria to meet or a standard to meet to define or identify discriminatory practices. And so critics are alarmed. The advocates were alarmed because they argued that this makes it essentially harder to challenge voter ID laws. This makes it essentially harder to challenge polling place closures or mail in voting restrictions. And so this narrowly, legally, what counts as actual discrimination. So that's 2013, 2021. Here it is, 2026. In the state of Louisiana, lawmakers are pushing to have new voter maps drawn and whether Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still allows strong challenges to racially discriminatory districting. Many groups or advocates for civil rights are arguing that maps, the maps dilute the black voting power by packing districts with black voters or splitting districts of black voters or splitting the districts apart in an effort to weaken black representation when it comes to voting. And so the conservative majority argued this. States could now justify maps using political motivations rather than racial motivations. And also that courts should not aggressively police racial outcomes from politically motivated drawn maps. So this is why it impacts the southern states the most. In the South, many black voters support the Democrat Party. And so, because of this, lawmakers, politicians can now redraw maps under the auspice of targeting Democrats versus saying plainly we're targeting black voters. And so, this is in essence what the issue is. This is why many advocates for civil rights are sounding the alarm, going and fighting to ensure that this does not succeed in the state of Louisiana. So we're in the fight in 2026, 60 years after the Voting Rights Act. We are still today fighting for representation, fighting for voting power. So I just come to inform you of what's happening, how it may impact you, so you can be knowledgeable about what's happening in your community. Be sure to like, share, follow us on YouTube, subscribe, and also follow the Substack and share it with your peers, your colleagues, your friends, and your family so they can be informed in real time. Thank you. This is Greg Jackson, once again, with the Black Urban and Rural Policy Review. Until next time.